Hello and welcome to our Bible study, the Gospel of Matthew. This is part 23. We are getting close to the end. I imagine there'll be about 25 parts in all. And it's a long gospel, but many wonderful, wonderful things. And so we have finished the 5 books that are at the heart of the gospel, books that have preaching narratives, teaching narratives of Jesus and his teaching discourses. And now we finished with the teaching discourses and all those books, and we're moving into a couple of chapters of passion narratives, the story of Jesus' trial and crucifixion. And today, Matthew chapter 26. We'll start with verses 1 through 5. When Jesus had finished saying all these things, he said to his disciples, "You know that after 2 days the Passover is coming, and the Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified." Then the chief priests and the elders of the people gathered in the palace of the high priest, who was called Caiaphas, and they conspired to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him. But they said, "Not during the festival, or there may be a riot among the people." Okay, so the reference to the chief priests and the scribes did not necessarily mean a large group of that leadership, probably just a small cadre of that group. Caiaphas was the high priest from the years 18 to about 36 AD, or in the Common Era. Jesus was seen as a prophet, and the people loved him. He was very popular among the people. The leaders feared the loss of their status or power from Rome, especially if there was misbehavior among the people. The Romans valued the religious leaders in that they were able to keep the peace. And if they were not able to keep the peace, they would be no use to the Romans and would lose their power. And parallels are set here between Calvary and Passover in the gospel. Jesus' death on Calvary was pictured in light of the Passover festival. Jesus crucified was akin to the Passover lamb slaughtered. Going over Matthew 26, verses 6 to 13. Now, while Jesus was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, a woman came to him with an alabaster jar of very costly ointment, and she poured it on his head as he sat at the table. But when the disciples saw it, they were angry and said, "Why this waste? For this ointment could have been sold for a large sum, and the money given to the poor." But Jesus, aware of this, said to them, "Why do you trouble the woman? She has performed a good service for me. For you always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me. By pouring this ointment on my body, she has prepared me for burial. Truly I tell you, wherever this good news is proclaimed, in the whole world, what she has done will be told in remembrance of her." So we don't know the name of this woman. She is unnamed here. In Luke's gospel, she's called a sinner, which means most likely a prostitute, often equated, I think, with Mary Magdalene. But we don't know that for sure. John's gospel says this was Mary, but Mary, the sister of Martha and Lazarus. No motivation is given for her action here, but Jesus called it beautiful. It may have been done to encourage Jesus to act, to take over, but his coronation was the cross. He knew this and he was open to this. Why the waste of ointment? Well, that seems like a valid question. A lot of money literally poured out. Jesus' remark that we always have the poor is not a justification to treat poverty as inevitable and just accept it. Helping alleviate suffering and poverty is fundamental to following Jesus. At the same time, Jesus was unique, and an opulent memorial for him was uniquely a beautiful thing. Underlying attitudes are vital, and Judas is described as the one who asked the question, "Why the waste?" In other gospel accounts. He's described as being greedy himself and wanting control of the money. For us, the temptation we have to see might be in supporting causes that we want or projects that make us feel good or look good, rather than genuine efforts to alleviate suffering and poverty. The call to use our unique gifts for good is fundamental. I mean, after all, as one writer said, Beethoven needed to compose, not run a soup kitchen. We each need to pay attention to the spiritual gifts that we have and utilize them. Then one of the 12, who was called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, "What will you give me if I betray him to you?" They paid him 30 pieces of silver. And from that moment, he began to look for an opportunity to betray him. I'm thinking that perhaps no one in human history is judged more harshly than Judas Iscariot, the one who sold out Jesus for the price of a slave, 30 pieces of silver. Yet, I have to think that had he repented, had he chosen to die with Jesus, we would consider him a saint. What is the message for us? Do we betray Jesus in other ways without repenting? The good news is that repentance is always available as long as we can seek it. And it's only when we get to the point where pride or cynicism or whatever it is prevents us from acknowledging our need for repentance and forgiveness, or in some other way just not being able to be open to it, that our state is truly tragic. Matthew 26, verses 17 to 30. On the first day of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus saying, "Where do you want us to make preparations for you to eat the Passover?" And he said, "Go into the city to a certain man and say to him, 'The teacher says, my time is near. I will eat the Passover at your house with my disciples.'" And so the disciples did as Jesus had directed them, and they prepared the Passover meal. And when it was evening, he took his place with the 12. And while they were eating, he said, "Truly, I tell you, one of you will betray me." And they became greatly distressed and began to say to him one after the other, "Surely not I, Lord." And he answered, "The one who has dipped his hand into the bowl with me will betray me. The Son of Man goes as it is written of him, but woe to that one by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that one not to have been born." Judas, who betrayed him, said, "Surely not I, Rabbi." And Jesus replied, "You have said so." While they were eating, Jesus took a loaf of bread, and after blessing it, he broke it, gave it to the disciples, and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." And then he took a cup, and after giving thanks, he gave it to them, saying, Drink from it, all of you, for this is the blood of the covenant, my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I will never again drink of this fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it anew with you in my Father's kingdom." And when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. So originally, there were two separate festivals. You probably heard me say this before. There was Passover, a one-day festival marking the passing over of the angel of death to those households, those Jewish households who had sprinkled the lamb's blood on their doorposts. And then there was a 7-day festival of unleavened bread, marking the Exodus itself, in which they didn't have time to let the bread rise, that story. Passover and unleavened bread in Jesus' day were usually celebrated as one festival. The meal began the evening of the first day, and of course, that's when the day began. It would often go over midnight into what we might consider the second day, but of course, still obviously the first day in the Jewish calendar. Jesus was probably staying out in Bethany, the home of Mary and Martha and Lazarus. There's some question, the house of Simon the Tanner, Simon the leper. Simon the Tanner was the story of Peter. But anyway, Simon the leper, that perhaps Simon was actually the father of Mary and Martha and Lazarus. Speculation, we don't know for sure. But Jesus was planning a quiet Passover meal with his disciples. The man that he sent the disciples to was likely a friend of Jesus who was wealthy enough to have a large upper room and servants. And in the meal, Jesus acted as host. He announced that Judas was the traitor, but no one seems to notice or react. The motive seems to have been for Judas to know that Jesus knew, but not arouse the other disciples to action against Judas. The term Eucharist means giving thanks. Jesus gave thanks. The communion liturgy is filled with praise. It was done to remember Jesus, remember who he was and what he did. The covenant is pardon for us through Christ's blood. Our part is to accept it, to embrace it, to give thanks for it. And at the end of the meal, Despite all the stress, Jesus went out singing. And then Jesus said to them, this is Matthew 26, 31 to 35. Jesus said to them, "You will all become deserters because of me this night. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will scatter. But after I am raised up, I will go ahead of you to Galilee." Peter said to him, "Though all become deserters because of you, I will never desert you." And Jesus said, "Truly, I tell you, this very night before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times. And Peter said to him, "Even though I must die with you, I will not deny you." And so said all the disciples. So say all of us. There is no condemnation of the disciples for running away from Jesus. We see them, the picture that Matthew gave them. They're seen as sheep scattered before a wolf. The importance of Jesus' prediction was not that he was all-knowing. It was not his omniscience, but it was his clear knowledge of human frailty and his great love for those who followed him. Galilee had been their home base, and Jesus knew that he would find them there. It's not clear that he knew in great detail how all of this would work or work out, but he had faith that they were all one in God, and that God would be with him through the shadowed valley of death. Matthew 26, verses 36 to 46. Then Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." And he took with him Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee, and began to be grieved and agitated. And then he said to them, "I am deeply grieved, even to death. Remain here. Stay awake with me." And going a little farther, he threw himself on the ground and prayed. And he said, "My Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me, yet not what I want, but what you want." And then he came to the disciples and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, "So could you not stay awake with me 1 hour? Stay awake and pray that you would not come into the time of trial. The spirit is indeed willing, but the flesh is weak." And again, he went away for the 2nd time and prayed, "Father, my Father, if this cannot pass, unless I drink it, your will be done." And then he came again and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. And so leaving them again, he went away and prayed for the 3rd time, saying the same words. And then he came back and found the disciples and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and taking your rest? See, the hour is at hand. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." So even today, there is an enclosed place at the foot of the Mount of Olives called Gethsemane, I guess a little garden-like area. Jesus left 8 disciples at the entrance. Judas, of course, was already gone at this point. He took with him the same three disciples who had witnessed his transfiguration, Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee, James and John. He went ahead to pray in great sorrow, and the 3 fell asleep. Jesus' sorrow was physical, it was emotional, it was spiritual. Maybe the upcoming suffering, certainly the betrayal, the pain of rejection and failure. And despite all of that, he was able to state, "Nevertheless, not my will, but yours." And I think this is the lesson for us in times of suffering and betrayal, the pain of rejection and failure, to be able and willing to say, "Nevertheless, despite everything, not my will, but yours be done." While Jesus was still speaking, still saying these things to his disciples about his betrayer coming, Judas, one of the 12, arrived, and with him a large crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had given them a sign saying, "The one I will kiss is the man. Arrest him." And at once he came up to Jesus and said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and he kissed him. And Jesus said to him, "Friend, do what you are here to do." And then they came and laid hands on Jesus and arrested him. Now, we don't know why. We don't know Judas' motivation for betraying Jesus. Maybe he was pushing Jesus or trying to use his powers to defeat the Romans and take over. Too often it's the person with skills and with intellect who ends up being the traitor. In ourselves, I think we're more often betrayed at the point we feel most confident and least reflective. We can easily see Judas as the betrayer, but we sure don't see Jesus as a victim. He clearly gave his life. It was not taken from him. And even to the end, it seemed he was concerned mostly for his betrayers and his adversaries. Matthew 26, verses 51 to 54. Suddenly, one of those with Jesus put his hand on his sword, drew it, and struck the slave of the high priest, cutting off his ear. And then Jesus said to him, "Put your sword back in its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Do you think I cannot appeal to my Father, and he would at once send 12 legions of angels? How then would the scriptures be fulfilled, which say it must happen this way?" So we can't know how many or what caliber of Roman soldiers and others who came to be present. It just says a large crowd. The temple guard were probably there, and they were perhaps a bit of a motley crew. It seems that some of Jesus' followers were armed. There was at least one with a sword. We know that violence always seems to lead to more violence and never to ultimate peace. But Jesus represented this truth by not using the attacking of the high priest's slave as an opportunity to attack the soldiers. He stopped that right there. Again, he was in control, and he was laying down his life on purpose and freely. Matthew 26, 55 to 68. At that hour, Jesus said to the crowds, "Have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me as though I were a bandit? Day after day, I sat in the temple teaching, and you did not arrest me. But all this has taken place so that the scriptures of the prophets may be fulfilled." And then all the disciples deserted him and fled. Those who had arrested Jesus took him to Caiaphas, the high priest, in whose house the scribes and elders had gathered. But Peter was following him at a distance, as far as the courtyard of the high priest. And going inside, he sat with guards in order to find out what would be happening. I lost my place here. Knowing how this would end, he said. Now the chief priests and the whole council were looking for false testimony against Jesus, so that they might put him to death. But they found none. They found none. Though many false witnesses came forward, at least 2 came forward and said, "This fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and build it in 3 days." The high priest stood up and said to Jesus, "Have you no answer? What is it they testify against you?" But Jesus was silent. And the high priest then said to him, "I put you under oath before the living God. Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." And Jesus said to him, "You have said so. But I tell you, from now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, "He has blasphemed. What is your verdict?" And they answered, "He deserves death." And they spat in his face. They struck him. Some slapped him, saying, "Prophesy to us, you Messiah. Who was it who struck you?" And the final section of this chapter, Jesus chastised the religious leaders who approached him this way. And all this was in keeping with the scriptures. That was the point of Matthew's gospel, the point that Jesus seemed to be making in this story, that the leaders were puppets of evil. Jesus was arrested. His followers fled. Peter at least had the courage to follow, but at some distance, as Jesus was taken to the house of the high priest. And this was further indication that this was not a legal arrest. Otherwise, Jesus would have been taken to a more public setting. All the Sanhedrin's rules were broken by having a secret examination in the middle of the night and by reaching a guilty verdict in this setting. This was not a trial. This was a sham. Caiaphas may be the most vile and hypocritical character in this story. He was concerned for the institutions of religion to the exclusion of religion's essential qualities. In terms of its historical accuracy, Matthew's account appears to be a good one. And Jesus essentially broke his silence and did claim to be the Messiah. The gospel ties this false trial to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. The temple in Jerusalem, the city, were destroyed in 70 AD, or 70 in the Common Era, by the legions of Rome following a rebellion. But the gospel writers tie that destruction of the temple to what Jesus is saying here and what they're saying about him to try to accuse him. And then the group mocked Jesus, spit in his face, and slapped him while he was helpless. They were all signs of utter contempt. And the insanity of the crowd took over, and they all condemned him. And now the final reading, Matthew 26, 69 to 75. Now Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard. A servant girl came to him and said, "You were also with Jesus the Galilean." But he denied it before all of them, saying, "I do not know what you're talking about." And when he went out to the porch, another servant girl saw him, and she said to the bystanders, "This man was with Jesus of Nazareth." And again he denied it with an oath, "I do not know the man." And after a little while, the bystanders came up and said to Peter, "Certainly you also were one of them, for your accent betrays you. You're a Galilean." And then he began to curse, and he swore an oath, Peter did, "I do not know the man." And at that moment, the cock crowed. And Peter remembered what Jesus had said, "Before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times." And he went out and wept bitterly. So Peter was experiencing a trial by fire, even at the same time Jesus was being tried in Caiaphas' house. The reality of Peter's denial and betrayal, and later his repentance and forgiveness by Christ, then his ascension to being a leader in the early church, marked the defining characteristics of Christian faith, that we are all sinners. We are all in need of grace and forgiveness. Peter made at least a half-hearted effort to be loyal, but the situation overwhelmed him, and he failed the test. Through this experience, and then through his experience of the risen Christ and the grace of God, Peter went on to become the rock of the church. There's room for repentance and renewal. All we have to do is ask and accept it. Thank you so much. This ends our study today. Next week, we'll move on to section 24. Thank you.